Welcome to Mosquito Fleet Monday, where we cover topics related to the Puget Sound Mosquito Fleet. Before the modern age of automobile ferries, people traveled the waters of Puget Sound in passenger and freight ships, known as the Mosquito Fleet. Sailing from the 1850s until around 1940, these vessels were all independently owned and operated. With little regulation or oversight, feuds and ferry wars often erupted. In this episode, we'll cover the famous fights of the Mosquito Fleet. Feuding ferry companies were a part of the Mosquito Fleet almost from the beginning. In 1859, the sidewheel steamship Eliza Anderson went into service from Olympia to Victoria, making all stops in between. Though not the first passenger steamer on Puget Sound, she was the first to be successful, and quickly began making enormous amounts of money for her owners. The fare from Olympia to Victoria was $20. For comparison, at the same time, a ticket for ship passage from San Francisco to Portland, Oregon was $5. It wasn't very long before other people wanted in on the business. The first ship to try was another sidewheeler, the Enterprise. When she tried to muscle in on the route, however, the owners of the Eliza Anderson dropped the fares to 50 cents with free meals. The Enterprise quickly gave up and was sold. Her engines ended up being torn out and were used to repower the Eliza Anderson. Next to step up to the plate was the ship Josie McNear. One of the reasons Eliza Anderson was so successful was that her owners had secured the lucrative mail contract. This meant that the U.S. government was paying them $36,000 a year to carry the mail to various ports of call, letting them make a significant amount of money even if they didn't carry any passengers or freight. So the Crosby family underbid the Wrights, the owners of the Anderson, and wrestled the mail contract away from them. The Crosbys then brought up the sidewheeler Josie McNear from San Francisco to begin running the Olympia to Victoria route, though her arrival was delayed due to damage in transit. Once the Josie McNear was put into service, Eliza Anderson went into dry dock for a month for work and upgrades, letting her rival run unopposed. But then, when the Anderson returned, the fight was on. On September 10, 1866, both steamers were in Olympia and were scheduled to depart north at the same time. Everyone came down to the waterfront to watch the inevitable race and exchange bets. The local newspapers had also taken sides. The Pacific Tribune staunchly supported the McNear, while the Washington Standard backed the Anderson. The Washington Standard was quick to make fun of the Josie McNear's long transit up to the Puget Sound when her boiler was damaged, and called her a floating corn crib. Roland Carey described the scene in his book, The Sound of Steamers. Shouts of encouragement followed the Eliza Anderson and Josie McNear as they pulled away from their respective wharves that Monday afternoon. Both steamers were of a style that was popular in that day on American waterways. Their great circular paddle boxes amidships reached to the height of their hurricane decks, and the name of each vessel was painted boldly across each paddle box. Down the inlet they steamed, beam to beam. Burning embers shot from the tall stacks. The throb of engines quickened, and the great paddle boxes turned faster and faster as firemen below heaved dry, pitch-laden cordwood into the hot fireboxes. The first stop on their route was Steilacoom. From there they would race to Seattle, then to Port Madison, Port Gamble, Port Ludlow, and Port Townsend. From Port Townsend, they would start the long run across the strait to Victoria. For the trip, Eliza Anderson set her fare at $2.50, including meals. The McNear had been charging $8, plus 50 cents a meal and $1 a night for a berth, but dropped her prices to match the Anderson. As the two vessels left Victoria to head back south, however, the Anderson snapped a shaft. The Josie McNear took aboard her passengers, and the embarrassed steamer limped back to Victoria for repairs. The war between Eliza Anderson and Josie McNear continued, with the two newspapers also continuing to fire volleys at each other. The McNear was now suffering frequent mechanical trouble, prompting the Washington Standard to ask, will they ever be in perfect trim so that the races will again become exciting? The Crosbys were determined to defeat the Anderson, so the Josie McNear was replaced by a newer, faster sidewheeler named the New World. The Washington Standard, who was not impressed, commented on her arrival. This elephant in the shape of a steamboat arrived last Saturday. What to do with her is the next question. But the New World was faster than the Eliza Anderson, so Anderson moved her Olympia departure time from 6 a.m. to 3 a.m. to keep ahead of her. Fares on both vessels dropped down to $1, and it quickly became a competition to see which company could lose money longer before giving up. The Pacific Tribune and the Washington Standard also became more vicious. The Pacific Tribune reported, as the steamer Anderson was making her wharf on Thursday evening, the old worm-eaten concern gave way from the pressure of the crowd upon it, precipitating a large number of persons into the mud and water beneath. Fortunately, but 2 were injured, and they not seriously. Finally, the New World was bought out by a new owner, who ended the feud by moving the New World to a different route. Now unopposed, the fares on the Eliza Anderson went back up. In 1869, however, a new challenger arrived on the scene. The Starr brothers had won the mail subsidy and were delivering the mail on a small sidewheeler named Alida, which was too small for the job. So the Wrights decided to replace the venerable Eliza Anderson with a newer, faster ship. They received the sidewheeler Olympia from a shipyard in New York and went to work. The Starrs quickly retaliated by getting a new fast sidewheeler of their own, the North Pacific. A race was held on June 27, 1871. Canadian money backed the Olympia, and the Americans supported the North Pacific. In his book Ships of the Inland Sea, Gordon Newell described the big race. Full speed and the paddle beat and the engine thump and the beginning of one of the most thrilling spectacles devised by man, an all-out race between two fast sidewheel paddlers. The design of the sidewheeler not only gave the ship a solid seaworthy look, it provided lots of visible action when the ship was underway. The black smoke poured out of the paint-blistered funnels in marcelled black waves to streak away aft with the speed of the steamers. The great iron walking beams blurred up and down with the thundering paddle buckets churning the water at the ship's sides into warring waterfalls that tumbled astern to form broad white wakes on the blue straits. The North Pacific reached Port Townsend 3 minutes ahead of the Olympia. The Starrs ended up paying Finch and Wright $7,500 a year to keep the Olympia off the Puget Sound. The ship was moved down to San Francisco, where another company paid out a subsidy to keep her off the routes there. Olympia made her owners more money than most ships do for years, without moving an inch. In 1878, the Starrs stopped paying the subsidy and the Olympia returned, but wasn't able to make a foothold on the Sound and was sold. In 1884, the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company moved into Puget Sound, and the Eliza Anderson was pulled from retirement to go against them. In response, the faster sidewheeler, the George E. Starr, was placed in opposition to her, following her wherever she went. The Eliza Anderson was put out of business once more when she was seized at customs and accused of smuggling Chinese people into the United States. Elsewhere, other smaller dramas were also playing out. In 1864, there was a contest between the Jenny Jones and the J.B. Libby. A man named W.W. Miller had won the contract for mail delivery and hired Captain Jimmy Jones of the propeller steamer Jenny Jones for the job. But the owners of the sidewheeler J.B. Libby wanted a piece of the action. On January 2, 1865, the two ships left Olympia. They ran neck and neck to Steilacoom, and each refused to yield when entering the harbor. The two ships collided at the dock. The J.B. Libby ended up too damaged to continue, so the Jenny Jones came out the victor. Meanwhile, in the town of Paulsbo, which is now a quaint Scandinavian town on the Kitsap Peninsula, it was once the focus of fierce Mosquito Fleet battles. The vessel Hyak of the Kitsap County Transportation Company was serving the town when local farmers, dissatisfied with the big company's schedule and prices, formed their own cooperative with the vessel Verona. Hyak and Verona left Paulsbo at the same time every morning and raced from dock to dock all the way to Seattle. More than once, they collided. To force maximum speed from the ships, engineers would tie down the safety valves on the boilers to prevent them from going off. Once, the smokestack got so hot on the Verona that she caught fire, though no one was hurt. Finally, the rivalry ended when KCTC bought the Verona. Having the fastest boat on Puget Sound quickly became a selling point and a reason for maximum bragging rights. In 1890, the funny-looking sternwheeler Greyhound was launched. Known as the Wheel and the Whistle, or the wheelbarrow upside down, the Greyhound was characterized by her long, low-slung deck and enormous sternwheel. Her owners quickly claimed that she was the fastest boat around and placed a gilded greyhound on her wheelhouse, along with a broom, the traditional symbol of a fast racing boat. A broom was often awarded after a race to signify that a boat had swept the competition. However, also launched that year was the magnificent sternwheeler Bailey Gatsert. The Gatsert approached the Greyhound in Elliott Bay and, as reported by Gordon Newell in the book Pacific Steamboats, Captain Hill of the Gatsert stepped out the wheelhouse door to holler across at the Greyhound. "What'll it take to get that hardware off your roof, Captain?" "Just come and take it," roared back Captain Troop of the Greyhound. "It'll come off real fast if there is a boat on the Puget Sound that can outrace the Hound, which there ain't." Well, the race was had, and by the end the Bailey Gatsert had come out on top. The gilt Greyhound and the broom were transferred to the victor, but it wasn't over yet. Captain Troop of the Greyhound had a brother in Oregon, where the enormous sidewheeler T.J. Potter operated, and he didn't like the sound of his brother getting beat. So he had the Potter brought up to Puget Sound to challenge the Gatsert. When both Bailey Gatsert and T.J. Potter were in Tacoma, set to leave for Seattle, word got around fast. Everyone headed for the waterfront, and money began to exchange hands. Puget Sounders backed the Bailey Gatsert, while Oregon money was behind the T.J. Potter. The two vessels took off north, full of cheering and jeering passengers, as the two racing paddlers steamed down the Sound. They were neck and neck as far as Point Robinson when an explosion shook the Bailey Gatsert. Fortunately, her boiler hadn't gone, but a nozzle had been blown out of her smokestack, which reduced her steam pressure. The T.J. Potter steamed ahead, arriving into Seattle ahead of the Gatsert. Captain Peace on the Potter sent a telegram to Captain Troop in Portland. Beat Gatsert. Time, Tacoma to Seattle, 1 hour, 22.5 minutes. Captain Troop sent back a brief reply. Get the dog. And so the Greyhound was removed from the Gatsert with the help of the Potter's fist-swinging crew. Steamboat races usually weren't one-and-done affairs, however, and the Bailey Gatsert, T.J. Potter, and the Greyhound had it out several more times. On April 27, 1891, the Tacoma Daily Ledger reported, Yesterday, the commander of the fleet sternwheeler Bailey Gatsert made up his mind to have a race with the T.J. Potter or blow a cylinder out. For 20 minutes they coquetted in the bay, and the smoke that rolled from their funnels took on a blacker hue. Finally, they seemed to have made up their minds to have it out. At exactly 10:28, they got an even start abreast at Brown's Point. Then each sprang suddenly forward as all steam possible was crowded on. For a few minutes they were neck and neck, tearing through the water at a tremendous rate. For probably 5 minutes, the fastest water traveling that was ever seen on the Sound took place. Finally, the Gatsert drew away from her big rival, and in a few minutes was a length in front. Then the Potter, having made one grand effort, dropped back and seemed not to try to keep up. The Potter landed in Seattle about 7 minutes later than the Gatsert. After this, the Gatsert circled Elliott Bay, tooting her whistle vigorously. Gatsert also faced the Greyhound again, as reported by Wilbur Thompson and Alan Beach in their book Steamer to Tacoma. The Bailey Gatsert was reluctant to race, but eventually accepted the challenge. The Greyhound blew her speed call, and quickly the Gatsert blew hers. The race was on. With great poof-poofs, the two boats roared over the 28-mile course. Later it is said that each steamer popped out a stick of cordwood at each poof. The two ships exchanged the lead several times, but it was the lean, puffing Greyhound that finished first, 3 minutes ahead of her rival into the Seattle dock. In 1891, the famous propeller steamer Flyer was launched on the Columbia River. She came up to Puget Sound and quickly made a reputation for being incredibly fast and for loving to race. On October 10, 1900, the large Canadian steamship Victorian challenged the Flyer to a race. At that time, the Flyer had a bent propeller blade, so the captain was trying to take it easy until the steamer could get into a dry dock for repairs. The Flyer never turned down a challenge, though, so she set off after the Victorian, but the vibration from the bent propeller was so intense that she backed off. At that time, however, a passenger leaned over the back rail of the Victorian and loudly asked if the Flyer would like a tow. At this insult, the Flyer leapt ahead and beat the Victorian into Tacoma. It quickly became clear that the Flyer, with a cruising speed of 16 knots, was the speed queen of the Mosquito Fleet, and that if a ship could beat her in a race, they'd really have something to brag about. With this in mind, Captain Hell-Roaring Jack of the sternwheeler City of Aberdeen decided to have it out with the big propeller steamer. One day, while the City of Aberdeen was paddling down the Sound towards Olympia, the Flyer was passing Alki Point and squaring up for the fast run to Tacoma, and Captain Jack knew that she would have to slow down to turn into the harbor at Tacoma. So he made a plan and called down to his engineer, telling the man to throw the ship's cargo of bacon into the boiler fire. By the time the Flyer had come alongside the City of Aberdeen, the smaller boat had built up a terrific grease fire in her boiler, and she smelled strongly of burning bacon. As the Flyer slowed down to turn into Tacoma, the City of Aberdeen blew her whistle in challenge and roared past the larger steamship. It is said that her paddle wheel was churning so hard she shucked herring over her own jackstaff. The Flyer was left confused, wallowing in her wake. The real rival of the Flyer, however, was the Puget Sound Navigation Company and their various subsidiaries. The Inland Navigation Company, a sub-company of Puget Sound Navigation, worked with the city of Tacoma to build a new municipal dock, and the Flyer was denied the right to land there. This led to a lawsuit, with the result that, since the municipal dock was a public dock, the Flyer could not be prevented from using it. In 1906, the steel steamer Indianapolis arrived on the Puget Sound, and was put on the Seattle to Tacoma run in opposition to the Flyer. Immediately, the Flyer set about trying to goad her rival into a race. The Flyer had an agreement with the Northern Pacific Railroad to honor tickets to Seattle, but then she started honoring the Indianapolis's tickets too. As the Indianapolis loaded at the dock, the captain of the Flyer would call out to those waiting in line, "All tickets honored on the Flyer." The Flyer also had a habit of cutting off Indianapolis in the harbor and blowing ha-ha whistles. But the Puget Sound Navigation Company strongly disapproved of steamboat racing, and so the Indianapolis resisted the urge to answer the Flyers' challenge. Finally, after 3 years of this, a special event in Tacoma on July 28, 1910, led to the Flyer and the Indianapolis leaving the dock at the same time. The race was on. A spectator described the scene as reported in Pacific steamboats. Cheered on by hundreds of spectators on shore and aboard the vessels, the steamship Flyer of the Flyer route and the Indianapolis of the Puget Sound Navigation Company last night fought out a battle in the gloom of the midnight hours on an all-out race over the 30-odd miles of Puget Sound between Tacoma and Seattle. The presence of so many spectators along the shores of Vashon Island and the mainland to view the midnight race was accounted for by the disturbance raised by the resonant whistles of the two sound greyhounds as they raced neck and neck, and by the shrieking of sirens from smaller craft inshore as the bigger vessels swept past. As both vessels sped past Alki Point and well into Elliott Bay, their whistles joining those of other vessels lying in the harbor produced sufficient noise to wake sleeping residents in the Queen Anne and Uptown districts and bring hundreds scurrying to ascertain what had happened along the waterfront. According to the Flyers people, the Indianapolis got into the stream first at Tacoma, and by the time the Flyer got her engine properly going was 4 minutes ahead. With the dash point light abeam, the Flyer had gotten within a length of the Indian, which was struggling hard to maintain her lead. From Dash Point to Robinson Point, the Flyer gradually crept up on the Indian, and when half the distance had been covered at Three Tree Point, the Flyer had established the suspicion of a lead. One of the Flyer's boiler tubes blew out between Robinson and Three Tree Point, and thereafter, although the Flyer came in on one boiler, she had the Indianapolis well beaten a quarter of the mile from the dock. The Flyer won by a sufficient margin to allow her landing of her passengers and getting away for a fresh supply of fuel before the Indianapolis had finished tying up at Coleman Dock. Passengers aboard either steamship declare that no matter what disputes have arisen over the midnight battle, in itself it was a splendid sight to see the two vessels churning the water and belching forth clouds of steam and smoke as, inch by inch for more than 30 miles, they desperately fought for mastery. The Puget Sound Navigation Company protested that the Indianapolis hadn't truly been racing and was only traveling at a normal rate of speed, but few on the Puget Sound believed it. A year later, the Puget Sound Navigation Company solved the problem once and for all by purchasing the Flyer and transferring her to the Seattle to Everett route. Short routes had their feuds too, like the brief run between Seattle and West Seattle. In 1903, the sidewheel ferry City of Seattle was having out with the steamer Lady of the Lake. Rides on the City of Seattle were 5 cents, but then the Lady of the Lake dropped to 4 cents. City of Seattle countered with 40 rides for $1. The two left port at the same time and would race each other to the other side of Elliott Bay every day. One day, the Lady of the Lake swerved and rammed the City of Seattle. Not long afterwards, the Lady of the Lake burned to the waterline while tied up for the night. Foul play on the part of folks from the City of Seattle was long suspected, but nothing was ever proven. One of the fiercest rivalries on the Puget Sound played out on the waters of Quartermaster Harbor on Vashon Island. Two business partners were running a steamer named the Norwood between Tacoma and Quartermaster Harbor when they had a falling out and ended up forming rival companies. The Vashon Navigation Company kept the Norwood, while the Tacoma and Burton Navigation Company ran another steamer named the Burton. The Vashon Navigation Company quickly got rid of the Norwood and had a new vessel named Vashon built. The two steamers, the Vashon and the Burton, made 3 round trips a day on the same schedule. The day before the Vashon went into regular service, she was waiting off Dockton for the Burton to arrive. Vashon whistled the Burton and they raced. Tacoma Daily Ledger reported it as one of the prettiest races ever seen in this vicinity. The next day, both vessels left Tacoma at the same time, both full of passengers, many of whom just wanted to see the race. Both steamers operated at maximum speed, but neither was able to pull ahead. They were evenly matched. Gordon Newell described the scene in the book Ships of the Inland Sea. The short dash across Dalco Passage was hard on the nervous passengers, and almost all of them were nervous before the feud ended. Belching black smoke tinged with the sulfur yellow of burning pitch, the two little steamers took off like nervous racehorses, scrambling for the favored position like angry ladies at a fire sale. They rode each other's bow waves, almost rail to rail, while the rival crews bawled insults at each other, and the passengers held on tight, hoping the boilers would do the same. Seeking an edge over their rival, in 1907, the Tacoma and Burton Navigation Company replaced the Burton with the new vessel, Magnolia. One day, between passenger runs, Captain Fred Sutter on the Magnolia was sent to Dockton to pick up a cargo of sacked clams. Captain Chance Wyman on the Vashon quickly followed. As the crew of the Magnolia started loading aboard the sacks of clams, the Vashon pulled up alongside and a fight ensued. The sacks were ripped open, and all hands on both vessels used the clams as ammunition in their war. The two ships were also known to bump each other, in one occasion knocking a woman passenger overboard. She didn't press charges, however, claiming that she simply hadn't braced herself properly, as you were supposed to do when racing steamers hit each other. Passengers on the rival boats were also known to engage in brawls and fistfights. A rate war also ensued, with fares dropping to 5 cents. It was not a situation that could continue. Finally, the two companies consolidated, and the two steamers were put on different schedules, giving islanders twice the number of trips a day. There was also a fight brewing on the west side of Vashon Island, along the Colval's Passage. The passenger steamer Sentinel was being operated on West Pass by the Merchants Transportation Company, while the West Pass Transportation Company was running the gas-engined propeller ship Virginia II along the same route. Twice in 1913, July and October, Virginia II and Sentinel collided, with the Sentinel coming out second best both times. Virginia II was faster getting underway, but the Sentinel gained speed over distance with her more powerful steam engines. The passengers in each community took sides, refusing to ride the opposing vessel. Because most of the wharves were only large enough for a single ship at a time, the faster boat could cut in and pick up their loyalists as well as the undecided, while the slower boat was forced to wait and then come in to pick up their own loyalists. In July of 1913, Virginia II was in the lead on the run from Vashon to Alki Point. She maneuvered in front of the Sentinel to put the steamship in her backwash. Sentinel couldn't pass on the inside, so she attempted to pass Virginia II on the outside. The two rolled in the Sentinel's swell, slamming her side into the Sentinel's and stoving in the steamship's side. Captain Joe Harrison of the Sentinel was reprimanded. Then, in October of 1913, the two passenger vessels collided again. At Cove on Vashon, the wharf was between a sandbar and a gravelly point. To land, a vessel would cut in close to the south point and leave by backing out of the cove. Sentinel was already at the dock, and the Virginia II managed to get around her bow and tie up on the inner side of the dock. The Virginia II pulled away first, but Sentinel also backed out and shifted sideways to block the mouth of the cove before making a multi-point shuffling turn to get around. Virginia II attempted to get around her, first around the front, and then the back, and then they collided. Both captains were reprimanded for this one. Eventually, things were settled when the Merchants Transportation Company agreed to only carry freight, while the West Pass Transportation Company would only carry passengers. Not long afterwards, the Sentinel was withdrawn from the West Pass entirely. As the 1900s progressed, smaller companies either went out of business or were consolidated, leaving two giants on top. The Puget Sound Navigation Company, of Joshua Green and the Peabody family, and the Kitsap County Transportation Company, led by W.L. Gasm. The two battled for supremacy over various routes on the Sound for several years. After Joshua Green used his influence at Seattle banks to try and sabotage KCTC's loans, Gasm responded by undercutting PSNC on their passenger and freight fares. He then went to Washington, D.C. to wrest away the mail contract. Green responded by banning the Kitsap County transportation boats from Coleman Dock, forcing them to move their operations to Pier 3. At one point, both companies were competing on the Seattle to Bellingham run. Joshua Green put out a statement regarding the war. The rate war is progressing finely, and we are doing practically all the business. The Bellingham merchants are coming over to us, and there is no truth to the rumor that the unions are against us. The number of passengers we are carrying daily shows how things are going in the fight. Gasm, meanwhile, put out a counter-statement. The merchants of Bellingham are standing back of us in this fight and doing all they can to establish our competing line. We have all the freight business we can take care of and are well pleased with our support both in Seattle and Bellingham. The Kitsap is on the Bellingham run to stay. The Steamboat Inspection Service, meanwhile, didn't look nearly as favorably on the fight, saying, "The safety of passengers on steamboats and launches must be the primary consideration, and women and children who travel on the water will be protected from unnecessary risks on boats of either the Kitsap County Transportation Company or Puget Sound Navigation Company on the Poulsbo or Bellingham route." The Seattle Times also had a few things to say about the fight. The feeling between rival companies in the rate war is strong, and not only do opposing vessels run on the same schedule, but they delight in passing one another and, apparently, in making it as unpleasant as possible for the other vessel without regard to the safety of the passengers. In 1916, the Kitsap County Transportation Company launched a new vessel named the Kitsap II and set out to prove their steamer was the fastest. They boasted greatly about her speed. It's even said that W.L. Gasm offered the Puget Sound Navigation Company a bet of $1,000 that the Kitsap II could beat their fast vessel, the Tacoma. Finally, Joshua Green of PSNC sent out the Tacoma to prove them wrong. On the 5 p.m. trip out of Seattle, Tacoma backed out, turned around, and waited. The Kitsap II rang full steam ahead and roared off. Captain Coffin on the Tacoma liked to give rivals a head start, so he waited a few minutes before setting off after her. In the distance between Coleman Dock and Smith Cove, Tacoma pulled ahead by 4 boat lengths. The Kitsap II gave her a salute, and the Tacoma headed for Alki. That settled that. Finally, the Puget Sound Navigation Company bought out Kitsap Transit, settling the fight once and for all. The last time a pair of evenly matched passenger steamers raced on the Puget Sound was May 22, 1948. Though this was a friendly match and not a true fight for supremacy. In 1948, the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society was formed, and to draw attention to their goal of maritime preservation, they decided to stage a good old-fashioned steamboat race. Only 2 authentic passenger steamers were still operating on the Puget Sound, the Virginia 5 and the Sightseer. Both were roughly the same size and power, and at that time they were engaged in the charter and excursion cruise business. The scheduled race was a great attraction on National Maritime Day, with heavy bets being placed on which would be the fastest boat. The race course started off Alki Point, rounded a buoy south of West Point, and then down into Elliott Bay to the finish line. Both vessels carried a full load of passengers and were heavily decorated. Over the 5-mile course, the Virginia 5 managed to pull ahead and won by 3/4 of a length. Her captain was presented with a painted broom, the traditional prize of a steamboat race. The broom is still on board the ship today. In 1968, the Sightseer was wrecked on the Columbia River and ended her career, leaving the Virginia 5 the only operating Puget Sound Mosquito Fleet steamer left. The ferries that run on Puget Sound now are almost all government-owned, either by the state in the case of Washington State Ferries, or by the local counties. No more do passenger ferries race on the Puget Sound, which, in the end, is probably for the best.